For more than 1 decade, the name of the Gestapo instilled fear throughout Germany and in a large part of Europe. Thousands were persecuted by its agents, and millions suffered the consequences of a system that used force as the norm. Its internal structure, its power, and its operational precision reached levels never before seen. It was born as a state institution, but it ended up acting to support a group that turned the law into an instrument of subjugation. What began with the promise of protecting was transformed into a machine that eliminated all opposition. Its influence extended to every space of daily life, where nothing remained outside its surveillance. Decisions came from the high commands, but those who executed them were common men who adopted a morality based on total obedience. Every action was part of a system that stripped value from individual conscience. How did that empire manage to sustain itself for 12 years without anyone stopping it from within? The birth, the Gestapo and the new German order of 1933. Following the seizure of power by the National Socialist Party, the country's political structure was immediately transformed. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor on January 30, 1933, and from that moment, the Nazis focused on consolidating their control. Hermann Göring, President of the Prussian Parliament, played a central role from the first day. On February 1st, he dissolved the Reichstag, leading to new elections for March 5th. In parallel, the propaganda offensive intensified. Goebbels and other leaders began to mobilize all state resources in favor of the new regime. The election campaign became a tool to crush their opponents. Göring declared that his purpose was not to win by a majority, but to destroy the enemies of the regime. To that end, he ordered the police to act without restrictions against communists and social democrats. On February 3rd, Hitler presented to the army commands his intention to rearm the country and eliminate Marxist influence. In that atmosphere of threat, on February 22, Göring decided to integrate 50,000 members of the SA and SS into the Prussian police under the name of auxiliaries. This measure granted them legal authority to arrest, raid homes, or even shoot. That same day, the Prussian Ministry of the Interior allowed police to shoot in case someone attempted to avoid an arrest. Furthermore, the requirements for carrying weapons were made more flexible. Göring appointed Rudolf Diels, a career official, but completely loyal to the party, as head of the police. Thus, the initial nucleus of what would soon be known as the Gestapo was consolidated. In parallel, the raids against opponents multiplied. On February 24, SA troops stormed the headquarters of the Communist Party, alleging conspiracies. In the middle of that climate, on February 27th, the Reichstag building burst into flames. Nazi authorities immediately attributed the authorship to the Communists, although it could never be proven. The next day, President Hindenburg signed the famous decree for the protection of the people and the state, which suspended basic civil rights, freedom of the press, of assembly, of expression, and the secrecy of correspondence. The police could carry out arrests without a judicial warrant and keep suspects detained indefinitely. With that legal framework, arrests soared. In Berlin alone, more than 1,500 people were arrested in 2 days. Prisons became saturated, and Göring authorized the creation of provisional camps, such as Köpenick, where prisoners were beaten or executed without any process. The Nazis used the term transfer to refer to these forced disappearances. Terror quickly took hold throughout Germany. Denunciations became commonplace. Neighbors informed on others due to simple suspicions or personal disputes. The fear of being accused paralyzed the population. In that context, Göring officially established the State Secret Police Department in Prussia, headed by Diels. This institution did not have an official name yet, but it already operated under its own criteria: total discretion, autonomy from other authorities, and a network of civilian informants. On March 8th, Diels ordered massive arrests in Berlin, and on March 9th, the city hall of the capital was occupied by direct orders from Göring. Thus, a police power parallel to the judicial one was consolidated. On March 21, the inauguration of the new parliament was celebrated in the garrison church of Potsdam, in an act full of symbolism between the old Prussian Empire and the new regime. Hitler appeared in a civilian suit, accompanied by Hindenburg, who wore a military uniform. In that staging, the message was clear: the continuity between the monarchy and the Third Reich was sealed. 4 days later, Parliament approved the Enabling Act, which granted the government the capacity to legislate without passing through the chamber. From that moment, Hitler's power had no checks and balances. In April, the Ministry of the Interior was reorganized to accommodate the changes. Regional police forces lost autonomy, and a centralized criterion of action was established. Diels, at the head of the Gestapo, received absolute freedom to act. He was not subject to parliamentary or judicial control. He only had to answer to Göring. During that same month, Jewish officials were expelled from public service. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service immediately excluded those who were not of Aryan ancestry or had communist affiliations. Thus, anti-Semitism was institutionalized as state policy. The blacklists grew incessantly. Diels ordered his agents to use all available means to monitor suspects. Hidden microphones were placed in homes, letters were intercepted, and night searches were authorized without a judicial warrant. By the end of April, hundreds of opposition newspapers had been shut down. Freedom of the press no longer existed. Editors were imprisoned, and many were sent to improvised camps. In parallel, the SA opened premises where they interrogated and beat detainees. The Gestapo supervised these centers but rarely intervened. Its role was more strategic, establishing priorities, identifying opposition networks, and facilitating lists of targets. In May, Diels began to organize the systematic compilation of personal files. Centralized archives were created with index cards for each suspect, including photographs, family relationships, friendships, and habits. This database was key to the subsequent functioning of the repressive apparatus. Every citizen could be investigated for comments, readings, or simple association with someone unfavorably viewed by the regime. On May 10th, a series of public acts in Berlin and other cities culminated in the burning of books. Works by Jewish, Marxist, or pacifist authors were thrown into the flames under slogans against intellectual corruption. The Gestapo discreetly supervised these acts. It was not its priority at that moment, but it did participate by identifying professors and students considered unreliable. In mid-June, Göring decided to formalize the structure of the secret body. The Gestapo, an abbreviation of Geheime Staatspolizei, Secret State Police, was officially established as an autonomous entity within the Prussian Ministry of the Interior. Diels remained in command, although his relationship with Himmler was already beginning to show tensions. The political control of the police had become a field of dispute among the party factions, but in that first stage, Göring still held the initiative. On June 20th, an internal directive was approved that allowed the Gestapo to act without informing any other state institution. This measure sealed its operational independence. Its agents did not need to identify themselves to local authorities, and its reports were confidential. Thus, an opaque system shielded from external control was built. Its logic was simple: to prevent any form of dissent before it arose. In July, the order was given to close the last social democratic newspaper. The repression already reached the entire political spectrum. In parallel, new units were founded responsible for specific tasks: censorship, counter-espionage, surveillance of foreigners, and monitoring of members of the clergy. Each department functioned with tactical autonomy, but under general coordination by Diels. At the end of August, Göring sent a secret communiqué to all regional police presidents. In it, he demanded maximum collaboration with the Gestapo and warned that any obstacle would be considered sabotage to the state. This document confirmed that the priority was the absolute control of civilian life. Preventive detentions were normalized. An unproven accusation was enough to spend months in prison. Toward September, the first transfers of political prisoners to more organized camps began. Dachau, initially under SA command, progressively passed to SS control. The Gestapo began to collaborate with these units, establishing filters to decide who should be sent and for how long. The duration of the confinement was indefinite. There were no trials or public records, only internal lists. The year ended with more than 100,000 people arrested since January. Diels declared that stability had been achieved thanks to continuous surveillance. By then, the Gestapo had already become the key instrument of the new regime, a faceless apparatus without law or limit. The Black Order, Himmler and the Nazi terror machine. When the police apparatus of Germany began to transform into a tool of absolute control, Heinrich Himmler, who was already head of the SAS, took another step to the front. In April 1934, he assumed command of the political police in Bavaria and little by little extended his dominion over other regions. Thanks to an agreement between Göring and Hitler, he was also entrusted with the direction of the Gestapo in Prussia. The transfer was approved by Hitler without hesitation, which marked the beginning of centralized control under the figure of Himmler. Göring had promoted the birth of the Gestapo, but his attention was diverted toward other fronts, which facilitated Himmler's advance. The Black Order, Himmler and the Nazi terror machine. When the police apparatus of Germany began to transform into a tool of absolute control, Heinrich Himmler, who was already head of the SAS, took another step to the front. In April 1934, he assumed command of the political police in Bavaria and little by little extended his dominion over other regions. Thanks to an agreement between Göring and Hitler, he was also entrusted with the direction of the Gestapo in Prussia. The transfer was approved by Hitler without hesitation, which marked the beginning of centralized control under the figure of Himmler. Göring had promoted the birth of the Gestapo, but his attention was diverted toward other fronts, which facilitated Himmler's advance. The latter quickly placed men of trust in key positions. Reinhard Heydrich, who directed the security service of the SS, SD, became one of the central figures of the new repressive machinery. Together they reorganized the structures of surveillance and extended control to all regions of the country. In a matter of months, the Gestapo ceased to be a regional organization to become a unified network. Himmler's method was based on an iron discipline and an inflexible hierarchy. There was no room for improvisation. Every order had to be executed without discussion, and punishment was immediate for anyone who deviated from duty. This rigidity was not only applied to subordinates, but also to the design of the system. Internal regulations were introduced that detailed even the slightest procedure, from interrogations to raids and preventive detentions. The Gestapo began to show its presence everywhere. It was no longer a body acting from the shadows, but a palpable entity. Offices, files, agents and informers multiplied across cities and towns. Any neighbor could be an informant. Rumors served as sufficient pretext to open files and apply measures. The political police did not need evidence. Suspicion or an anonymous denunciation was enough. Himmler imposed a logic of total surveillance. For him, there were no neutral citizens. Everyone was a potential ally or enemy of the regime. This mentality translated into searches without prior notice, nighttime arrests and constant following. Special prisons, improvised detention centers, and interrogations without legal guarantees became part of the ordinary functioning. The command structure within the Gestapo was modified to ensure that orders always originated from the top leadership. Every regional office had to report directly to Berlin. Centralization was key to guaranteeing that no province escaped ideological control. Himmler wanted a single will, his own. Heydrich's role grew. Although formally a subordinate, he acted as the operational brain. It was he who perfected the methods of cross-surveillance, where even agents were spied on by other agents. This duplication of controls guaranteed loyalty and eliminated any attempt at internal deviation or criticism. Meanwhile, new categories of enemies of the state were established. It was no longer just about communists or socialists, but also Jehovah's Witnesses, Freemasons, homosexuals, and anyone considered incompatible with the new order. This expansion of targets served to justify massive raids and broaden the scope of action for the police forces. Heydrich was meticulous, obsessed with details. He kept personal files on every important official, on every illegal organization, and on possible strategic allies. Nothing escaped his surveillance network. His office was a hive of papers, index cards, and records. His team worked without pause under constant pressure. Himmler's profile contrasted with his public image. He always presented himself as a discreet, almost insignificant bureaucrat, but behind that appearance hid an unscrupulous calculator. He did not raise his voice, did not gesture, and avoided unnecessary contact. But every step he took was aimed at consolidating a system of administrative terror. Despite the brutality of the apparatus, Himmler insisted on giving a legal veneer to every action. Decrees were drafted, ministerial orders were issued, and minutes were drawn up for every intervention. This bureaucratic formality did not serve to protect the victims, but to shield the executioners. The rules were created by them and applied without possibility of defense. Heydrich, for his part, adopted a posture of extreme coldness. He avoided emotions. Everything was reduced to figures, reports, and statistics. In his logic, arrests were numbers, interrogations were procedures, and disappearances were closed files. His emotional detachment was part of the efficiency mechanism he intended to establish. The Gestapo began to operate as if it were an entity outside of time. It was not subject to judicial deadlines or territorial limits. Its agents crossed provinces, burst into homes without a judicial warrant, and transferred prisoners from one camp to another without leaving a documentary trace. The anonymity of its operations was its greatest guarantee of impunity. A network of preventive prisons was created that did not depend on the Ministry of Justice. Himmler preferred to manage these centers directly, where detainees had no access to lawyers or the possibility of appeal. The conditions were inhuman, but it didn't matter. The goal was not to punish crimes, but to neutralize threats before they occurred. Internal reports made it clear that regional chiefs had to keep under surveillance not only known opponents, but also public figures, academics, journalists, and even priests. Any influence that escaped the party's control was seen as a potential risk. The concept of protection of the state became the universal justification. Any intervention, however arbitrary, was protected under that formula. There was no need to prove anything. The simple fact of being singled out was enough to be eliminated from the environment. Heinrich demanded measurable results. Every week, regional delegations sent statistics on arrests, seizures, and searches. Competition among officers to stand out generated a spiral of excesses. It was not about justice, but about demonstrating repressive effectiveness. The Black Order, as the internal structure of the SS under Himmler was known, extended beyond the police. It penetrated the courts, civilian bodies, transport organizations, and educational institutions. Everything had to serve the goals of ideological purification. Indoctrination sessions were organized for new recruits, where they were instructed about internal enemies, racial superiority, and the necessity of obeying without question. The courses were not optional, they were an essential part of the training. The presence of the Gestapo became omnipresent. There was no public act, meeting, or initiative without the invisible gaze of its agents. It was impossible to know if someone was listening in an informal conversation. Social silence was imposed as a collective defense mechanism. The central offices were modernized. Specialized departments for the press, religion, economy, from the purge to total police, the Gestapo after the Night of the Long Knives. After consolidating political power and securing the obedience of the police forces under Himmler's direction, the Gestapo began to move against those who, within the Nazi Party itself, represented an obstacle to the plans for reorganizing the repressive apparatus. Ernst Röhm, head of the SA, appeared as an uncomfortable and potentially destabilizing figure. His influence within the movement was considerable, and his control over hundreds of thousands of armed men worried those who wanted a vertical structure controlled from Berlin. For months, high commanders of the SS, along with political and military officials, had been collecting evidence, rumors, and testimonies about alleged conspiratorial activities within the SA. This observation work, led by the Gestapo, was decisive for the operation that would follow. The plan against Röhm was approved in the innermost circle of power. On June 30, 1934, Hitler travelled to Bavaria with a select group. That morning, after receiving the final report prepared by Heinrich and the intelligence services, he ordered the immediate execution of the SA chief. Röhm was arrested in a hotel along with other close collaborators. Some were executed instantly. Others, like Röhm himself, received the order to commit suicide. Upon refusing, he was eliminated by men trusted by Himmler. In Berlin and other cities, armed squads were deployed to arrest or liquidate dozens of people included in lists previously prepared by the Gestapo. Politicians, SA officers, and figures linked to internal party circles were murdered in a coordinated operation executed with military precision. In total, more than 70 people died during that purge known as the Night of the Long Knives. Although officially they spoke of an attempted coup, in reality it was a systematic elimination of internal opponents. The Gestapo's role was central, both in the data collection phase and in the logistical execution of the arrests and violent actions. This episode consolidated Himmler's power, strengthened the SS leadership, and left the secret police in a key position within the system of repression. From this point on, the structure of the police began to undergo a profound reorganization. Göring, until then responsible for the political police of Prussia, progressively ceded functions to Himmler. This new position gave him direct control over the secret services in several regional states, which allowed him to create a uniform surveillance network under his command. Reinhard Heydrich, as head of the SD, was in charge of centralizing reports and coordinating operations between the different security branches. In April 1935, another decisive step was taken. The criminal police, until then subordinate to local structures, was also placed under the supervision of Himmler. With this measure, ordinary criminal investigations were integrated into a system of political control. In June of the same year, a central office for the fight against delinquency was created, headquartered in Berlin, directed by Arthur Niebuhr. Although nominally it was about combating common crimes, in practice the unit became another tool of the repressive apparatus. The transformation was not only administrative, the new internal rules established a strictly vertical hierarchical system in which each level answered directly to the immediate superior. The personnel was selected from party members with solid ideological training and commitment to the National Socialist project. Training included interrogation techniques, surveillance, infiltration, and management of informer networks. Coordination between the Gestapo, the criminal police, and the SD became daily and systematic. Individual files, surveillance lists, and analysis structures were created to identify any indication of opposition, both real and imaginary. One of the most significant changes was the creation of the so-called preventive detention camps. In them, people arrested for suspicion of enemy activity could be held indefinitely without trial. This procedure, protected by special decrees issued from the Ministry of the Interior, granted the Gestapo unprecedented power to act outside of any judicial control. In practice, any anonymous denunciation, any comment considered ambiguous, or any association with people viewed unfavorably by the regime could lead to an arrest with no return. The Ministry of the Interior, under the control of Wilhelm Frick, actively collaborated in the legalization of these practices. Regulations were modified, norms were adapted, and new legislative texts were introduced that granted legal cover to the actions of the political police. The boundary between crime and dissent was completely blurred. The laws were drafted with vague, intentionally ambiguous terms, which allowed for discretionary application by the agents. At the same time, the population was encouraged to collaborate with the authorities, promoting denunciation through propaganda campaigns. The reorganization culminated with the unification of all forces under a single command. In 1936, Himmler was named head of the German police. This appointment made him the supreme head of both the security police and the order police. The measure, formalized by decree, meant the disappearance of any regional autonomy. The Länder lost their competencies in matters of public safety. From that moment on, all decisions were made from Berlin, with centralized reports and rigidly established lines of command. The new police was not only a repressive body, its function also included ideological surveillance. Cultural activities, sports associations, educational institutions, and the media were constantly monitored. Any deviation from the official thought was reported and analyzed. The idea of a thought police began to take shape. Control was not limited to visible acts, but aimed to mold behaviors, opinions, and feelings. The personnel who advanced within these structures shared a very specific profile: absolute loyalty to the Führer, fanatical adherence to the party, and a willingness to execute orders without questioning them. Promotion did not depend on professional merits, but on ideological fidelity. Internal reports, superior testimonies, and active participation in repressive operations were fundamental criteria for advancing in the hierarchy. Rapid promotions were given to those who showed initiative in detecting enemies of the state, even if it required creatively or exaggeratedly interpreting evidence. Within the Ministry of the Interior, the reforms were comprehensive. Police schools were adapted to the new context. Subjects such as racial doctrine, principles of National Socialism, and state security were included. Examinations incorporated evaluations of political attitude. Instructors, selected for their experience in the SS or the Gestapo, imposed strict discipline. Training no longer responded to technical standards, but to ideological ones. The mission of the police, according to the new doctrine, was to protect the national community against every harmful element. In parallel, the Ministry of Justice accepted its subordinate role. A special jurisdiction was created for cases considered politically sensitive. Judges were selected for their fidelity to the regime. Prosecutors received direct instructions from the Gestapo. Sentences were adjusted to what the party expected. The judicial system completely lost its independence. In many cases, the legal process was omitted entirely, and the accused were transferred directly to detention camps. With this fully consolidated structure, the Gestapo became the most feared arm of the regime. It no longer needed to justify its actions. Its authority was based on terror, opacity, and the certainty that no one was safe. The population, aware that any word could turn against them, adopted an attitude of constant vigilance. German streets, public offices, factories, and private homes became spaces of suspicion and control. The objective was no longer simply to eliminate opposition, but to prevent it from ever existing. The Eye of the Reich: Expansion, Conspiracy and Control. On January 10, 1936, General von Fritsch received a classified report from the Gestapo. Its content revealed that some army officers were in contact with the former Chancellor von Schleicher. The existence of links between high commanders of the Reichswehr and the old monarchist environment was also pointed out. That communication included a clear recommendation to closely monitor the implicated officers. From that moment, distrust toward the military estate became institutional. Simultaneously, a broader operation was activated. The Gestapo extended its network within the army. Informers infiltrated the units, the military academies, and the command circles. Reports arrived directly in Berlin. Any sympathy for Hindenburg, Schleicher, or the old order was noted and stored. The objective was clear: to neutralize all resistance within the armed forces before an eventual warlike conflict. Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, was one of the main targets. The police apparatus began to compile information about his movements and contacts. Suspicions included discreet meetings with conservative figures. At the same time, some of his collaborators were subjected to surveillance. The military intelligence structure began to be surrounded. In parallel, the Gestapo refined its methods abroad. Starting from 1936, special agents traveled to various countries in Europe. Their mission consisted of evaluating the terrain for future operations. Paris, Prague, Brussels, and Warsaw became habitual destinations. The reactions of the governments were studied. Leaders of Jewish communities were identified, and data on German exiles were compiled. The reports were detailed and analyzed in Berlin with rigor. One of the first operations developed in Vienna. Contacts with the radical wing of Austrian nationalism were strengthened. Funds, propaganda materials, and specialized technicians were sent. Acts of sabotage and disinformation campaigns were also organized. The goal was to prepare the way for an annexation without significant resistance. In that context, the Gestapo acted as a catalyst for internal tensions. In Prague, the situation was more complex. The Czechoslovakian regime maintained a firm stance against foreign interference. However, German security services managed to establish links with some Germanophile sectors. The reports described the country's internal divisions and the mood of the German population in the Sudetenland. That information would prove crucial later on. Special attention was also paid to Belgium and the Netherlands. Possible collaborators were sought there within the local fascist movements. Some groups were infiltrated and used as channels to distribute ideological material. The espionage network expanded without pause. On the internal front, Heinrich Himmler deepened his control. He not only directed the Gestapo, but also the SS and a large part of the police apparatus. To consolidate that dominance, he created a vertical command structure in which each level responded directly to the superior without possibility of discussion. Orders were transmitted with speed and without ambiguity. Any deviation was considered suspicious. The figure of Reinhard Heydrich gained even more weight. As head of the Reich Main Security Office, he centralized the archives, surveillance methods, and coordination among departments. Under his direction, millions of files on citizens, opponents, officials, and members of the army were classified. The apparatus was becoming increasingly precise. During that same period, a purge occurred within the police ranks. Elements considered unreliable or with links to the past were removed. New cadres, trained within the National Socialist ideology, took over. The result was a loyal and operational structure, ready to act immediately upon any signal. In 1937, regional coordination centers were established. These nodes allowed information to flow in both directions, from the peripheral zones to the central headquarters and vice versa. Furthermore, blacklists were created that included union leaders, intellectuals, religious figures, and businessmen. No one remained outside the radar. The expansion project also included the German communities abroad. Cultural associations, sports clubs, and youth groups were promoted. Under this facade, agents operated who compiled data, evaluated attitudes, and encouraged adherence to the regime. The consulates collaborated discreetly. The budget allocated to these operations grew significantly. Funds came partly from the Ministry of the Interior, but resources obtained through unofficial means were also used. Forced donations, confiscations, and agreements with certain companies generated additional income. Everything was allocated to reinforcing the structure. By the end of 1938, with the annexation of Austria already accomplished, protocols were designed to replicate the model in other territories. Detention lists were prepared, propaganda campaigns were organized, and provisional administration plans were established. Nothing was left to chance. The Gestapo then became a tool of conquest. It was no longer limited to repressing dissent, but acted as the spearhead for the advance of the Third Reich. Where the agents trod, troops soon arrived. Where the emissaries infiltrated, the banners with the swastika soon appeared. The machinery was in motion. The Reign, terror in occupied Europe. At the beginning of 1940, when the German army entered Poland, the units of the Gestapo followed very closely. As soon as they crossed the border, Reich security agents began to intervene directly. Sonderkommando 4, led by Herbert Fischer, was one of the first units to act. Their arrival in Katowice marked the start of an operation aimed against university professors, clerics, officials, and any figure linked to the old Polish system. Arrests were immediate and selective. In Poznan, the orders came directly from the Reichsführer. Eradicating any possibility of resistance was demanded. Raids on homes and offices were constant. Members of the Polish intelligence, professors and priests were also executed there. Summary executions became routine. In Lublin, another group led by Dr. Herbert Kappler repeated the same scheme: arrest, interrogation, and elimination without trial. The mission was to neutralize every form of pre-existing authority. The Gestapo also directed actions against the Jews from the first day. The Warsaw Ghetto, for example, did not arise from a local decision, but as a result of directives from the central apparatus. Officials such as Ludwig Hahn and Leopold Spann ordered the confinement, forced transfer, and total control of the Jewish quarter. Hunger, disease, and violence were part of the system. The Gestapo organized deportations without prior notice and established direct contact with the camps in the east. When the Wehrmacht advanced to the west, the Gestapo did not stay behind. In France, Heinrich Müller sent detachments with the order to secure total control over the occupied zones. Paris, Lyon, Bordeaux and Marseille were also occupied by agents of the Security Service and Department 4 of the Reich Main Security Office. One of the first to act was the SS officer Helmut Knochen, who established a central office in the French capital from where arrests, deportations and executions were coordinated. Collaboration with the French police facilitated the operations. The operational structure of the Gestapo in France was built in a few months. Special commissariats were established, local personnel were recruited, and translators were employed to facilitate interrogations. The arrests of resistance members, communists, Jews, and foreigners suspected of political activities were systematic. In various cities, local networks of surveillance and collaboration were created that reported directly to the central office in Paris. The repressive system on French soil operated with autonomy. They did not need authorization from the army to act. Gestapo Office 4 assumed surveillance and punishment tasks without consulting the Wehrmacht. The German military command did not always share the methods used by the security agents. There were tensions between both structures. While army officers sought to maintain order and avoid uprisings, the Gestapo imposed terror. Public executions, forced transfers and torture were common practices. In Belgium and the Netherlands, the same model was repeated. Reinhard Heydrich organized the operations from Berlin and sent trained personnel to install detention centers, regional commissariats, and surveillance cells. The SD absorbed local intelligence functions, while the Gestapo was in charge of capturing opponents, conducting interrogations, and organizing deportations to the east. In Amsterdam, Wilhelm Haster coordinated the elimination of clandestine networks. In all the territories under occupation, the army became a secondary figure compared to the Reich's police apparatus. On several occasions, Wehrmacht officers protested the unnecessary violence, but their complaints were ignored. The Nazi hierarchy had determined that internal security should not depend on the military command, but on the security forces led by Himmler. The Gestapo moved with total independence, with its own vehicles, facilities, and communication lines. The figures of detainees and executed people increased every month. Blacklists were drawn up with names of suspects and collaborators. Many were arrested for simple anonymous denunciations. Others were included in registers for racial, ideological, or religious reasons. The procedures were automatic: arrest, transfer, interrogation, and elimination or deportation. The Gestapo left no legal trace. There was no judicial record or guarantee. On the internal front, the presence of the Gestapo in Germany also became more visible. Mobile units were created that toured provinces, intercepted letters, listened to phone calls, and monitored family gatherings. The objective was to ensure that the civilian population did not deviate from the party's directives. Arrests for hostile comments or demoralizing attitudes were frequent. In many cases, a single phrase was enough to end up in a cell. The police apparatus had achieved such a degree of autonomy that it no longer answered even to the Ministry of the Interior. Himmler, as supreme chief, coordinated directly with his subordinates and with Hitler. No minister, no officer, not even party members could intercede for someone arrested. The power structure was closed, vertical, and without possibility of appeal. Meanwhile, control methods were perfected, detention centers were expanded, torture rooms were equipped, and new interrogator groups were trained. Mass deportations were carried out on trains organized by the Gestapo in coordination with the SS. Transports departed from France, Belgium, Holland, Poland, and Germany. All had the final destination in extermination camps like Auschwitz or Treblinka. The logistics were calculated, punctual, and brutal. As the war progressed, the Gestapo intensified its role. It consolidated itself as the key force in the control of the occupied continent. Not even military defeats halted its expansion. Wherever the army retreated, the terror agents left behind a consolidated network of informers, searches, prisons, and victims. Regarding statistics, while the text describes a systematic and massive increase in arrests and executions across various groups, communists, socialists, Jehovah's, witnesses, Masons, homosexuals, religious figures, academics, resistance members, and people targeted for racial, ideological, religious reasons. It does not provide concrete numerical statistics for these specific groups. Only general figures like thousands were persecuted. Millions suffered the consequences, and a final figure stating that by the end of 1933, more than 100,000 people had been arrested since January. The fear network in France and the Eastern Territories. From the beginning of the occupation, Gestapo agents arrived in Paris. They first set up at number 18 on Avenue Foch, and later took number 84 as their main headquarters. That building, previously bourgeois in style, was fitted out with interrogation rooms, offices, private rooms, basements for confinements, and a torture chamber. On the second floor, at the end of a hallway, were the main offices, where the highest-ranking officials were installed. The cells and torture spaces were in the basement. An official named Friedrich Berger, always dressed in civilian clothes, was the one who directed the Paris section, although he depended directly on the Reich Main Security Office in Berlin. From there, Berger controlled a network of agents throughout the Île-de-France region. His unit was small at first, but later officials like Kämpfer, who operated in the headquarters in Rouet, and others like Göring and Knochen, who arrived later from Germany with specialized teams, were integrated. The methods were similar in each location. The victims were transported, subjected to violent interrogations, and then returned to prisons or deported. Many ended up in concentration camps, others were executed without trial. The Gestapo organized raids, nighttime arrests, and permanent surveillance, especially against communists, Gaullists, and members of resistance networks. In Toulouse, the headquarters was on Rue de la Pomme. The commanders were officials like Rauter, later replaced by Wagner, and later by other elements who came from the SS. In Marseille, the headquarters was on Rue Paradis. In Lyon, the command post was located at number 32 on Rue Tête d'Or, where Klaus Barbie came to have the entire system of arrests and transfers under his control. In Bordeaux, the Gestapo was installed in a confiscated building under the command of Becker, and in Lille it operated on Rue de la Barre. Every city had its section, but all responded to direct control from Berlin. The Gestapo became an omnipresent body, with the capacity to intervene in any organization, without judicial control or territorial limitation. The French police commanders, subordinate at first, ended up actively collaborating. The milice, the Vichy police, handed over prisoners to them, participated in raids, and served as an auxiliary arm. The interrogation methods in France replicated those already applied in Germany and Poland. Systematic beatings, sleep deprivation, suspension by the wrists, burns, death threats, and pressure on relatives were common resources. Many of those interrogated died in the rooms or were thrown lifeless onto the streets. Others, after resisting or informing, were deported. Deportations were not always carried out with judicial criteria. An official's order was enough. In Drancy, Compiègne, and Fresnes, train cars were filled with men, women, and children without prior processes. On the other side of Europe, the situation was even more brutal. When the Wehrmacht advanced into Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic countries, the Gestapo units arrived behind the soldiers. In those areas, command was organized into commandos, led by SS officers. One of them was Commander Rasch, who headed Einsatzgruppe C, responsible for thousands of executions. Another was Jeckeln, in charge of Einsatzgruppe D, which operated in the south. Both obeyed direct orders from the Reich Security Main Office, and every action was recorded and sent to Berlin. In Riga, the fear network in France and the Eastern Territories. From the beginning of the occupation, Gestapo agents arrived in Paris. They first set up at number 18 on Avenue Foch, and later took number 84 as their main headquarters. That building, previously bourgeois in style, was fitted out with interrogation rooms, offices, private rooms, basements for confinements, and a torture chamber. On the second floor, at the end of a hallway, were the main offices, where the highest-ranking officials were installed. The cells and torture spaces were in the basement. An official named Friedrich Berger, always dressed in civilian clothes, was the one who directed the Paris section, although he depended directly on the Reich Main Security Office in Berlin. From there, Berger controlled a network of agents throughout the Île-de-France region. His unit was small at first, but later officials like Kempfer, who operated in the headquarters in Rouet, and others like Göring and Knochen, who arrived later from Germany with specialized teams, were integrated. The methods were similar in each location. The victims were transported, subjected to violent interrogations, and then returned to prisons or deported. Many ended up in concentration camps, others were executed without trial. The Gestapo organized raids, nighttime arrests, and permanent surveillance, especially against communists, Gaullists, and members of resistance networks. In Toulouse, the headquarters was on Rue de la Pomme. The commanders were officials like Rauter, later replaced by Wagner, and later by other elements who came from the SS. In Marseille, the headquarters was on Rue Paradis. In Lyon, the command post was located at number 32 on Rue Tête d'Or, where Klaus Barbie came to have the entire system of arrests and transfers under his control. In Bordeaux, the Gestapo was installed in a confiscated building under the command of Becker, and in Lille it operated on Rue de la Barre. Every city had its section, but all responded to direct control from Berlin. The Gestapo became an omnipresent body, the fear network in France and the Eastern Territories. From the beginning of the occupation, Gestapo agents arrived in Paris. They first set up at number 18 on Avenue Foch, and later took number 84 as their main headquarters. That building, previously bourgeois in style, was fitted out with interrogation rooms, offices, private rooms, basements for confinements, and a torture chamber. On the second floor, at the end of a hallway, were the main offices, where the highest-ranking officials were installed. The cells and torture spaces were in the basement. An official named Friedrich Berger, always dressed in civilian clothes, was the one who directed the Paris section, although he depended directly on the Reich Main Security Office in Berlin. The experiments of the Nazi sages. Since the beginning of the war, access to the concentration camps was restricted for any visitor outside the SS. In those places, both the officers and the medical personnel carried out activities to which civilians were not allowed entry. The power granted by Himmler gave a free pass to human experimentation under the regime's cover. One of the first to obtain direct authorization was Dr. Sigmund Rascher, who proposed carrying out extreme tests on prisoners in Dachau with the objective of compiling physiological information relevant to the German air service. In 1941, Rascher installed a hypobaric chamber where he subjected the inmates to simulations of progressive altitude until causing them to lose consciousness. Many did not survive the procedure. Rascher documented all the results and delivered them to the medical service of the Luftwaffe. His report, titled Extreme Altitude Experiments, was forwarded by Generaloberst Milch to Göring with a top-secret stamp. At the same time, in Dachau, trials on hypothermia also began to be carried out. Russia had naked prisoners placed in tanks of ice-cold water to measure the resistance time of the human body to low temperatures. Others were taken outside during the night, with the objective of exposing them to the winter cold until they stopped reacting. Resuscitation methods were also tested, from hot baths to direct contact with the bodies of selected women from the staff. Dr. Holzlerner, along with Rascher, presented the results at a scientific session held in Nuremberg in 1942 before high representatives of the military medical corps. Some attendees questioned the methods used, but no one raised serious objections against those responsible. Rascher was praised by Himmler, who promoted him in rank and provided him with more resources. In addition to the altitude and hypothermia experiments, Himmler ordered him to explore blood coagulation with a substance called polygylene, testing it directly on wounds inflicted on the inmates. Another doctor, Dr. Gebhardt, also carried out similar tests in Ravensbrück, using women captured by the Gestapo to test antibiotics and the effects of surgically induced injuries. The victims were selected based on their physical condition and usefulness for the experiment. Once the observations were finalized, many were eliminated. The experiments also included studies on the use of mustard gas. In Sachsenhausen, the inmates were exposed to blistering agents to observe the evolution of the burns and their reaction to possible treatments. Professor Lautz, an army doctor, was involved in these investigations. In Auschwitz, Dr. Klauberg focused on female sterilization through intrauterine injections that caused irreversible damage. Radiation was also applied to the genitals of the prisoners to cause infertility. Dr. Schumann conducted these procedures with express authorization from Berlin. Himmler requested a complete report on the effectiveness of these techniques for their possible mass use. In Buchenwald, Dr. Ding Schuler experimented with typhus vaccines. Prisoners were infected with virulent strains to check the immunological capacity after having received previous injections. The results were classified and sent to the Robert Koch Institute. In that same camp, treatments for tuberculosis with unauthorized drugs were also tested. The clinical trials were carried out without any type of consent. In many cases, those affected were murdered after completing the observation cycle. In Ravensbrück, in addition to surgical experiments, tests were carried out with chemical compounds applied to open wounds. The objective was to study healing under controlled conditions of infection. The subjects were prevented from receiving sufficient food to modify metabolic parameters. In Dachau, experiments on the consumption of seawater were also conducted. Some prisoners were forced to drink only salty liquid for days, while their physical reactions were measured. Allegedly potabolizing preparations were then administered. None of the methods managed to reduce the effects of dehydration. Most of those involved died or were left in a terminal state. In the Neuengamme camp, the viability of using biological bombs with infectious pathogens was studied. For that, bacteria were inoculated into the skin of previously weakened detainees. They sought to accelerate the contagion process. The final report was sent to the Reich Institute of Hygiene. All these studies had institutional backing. Those responsible did not act on their own behalf, but with the approval of high-ranking officials of the SS, the Military Medical Corps, and the research departments of the regime. The Gestapo participated in the selection of the victims, especially in cases where specific profiles were required. On several occasions, the inmates were chosen directly by police officers who knew the scientific objectives. The number of experiments increased as the war advanced. Projects with possible direct application on the front or in internal security were prioritized. Some reports were analyzed by the Air Ministry, the Reich Security Office, and Himmler's teams. None were rejected for ethical reasons. The data obtained were considered valuable assets for the state. The responsible doctors received promotions, medals, and additional funds. The majority were never prosecuted during the conflict. Upon the war's conclusion, only some appeared before international tribunals. Many managed to hide their involvement or justify their actions as legitimate investigations. In the years of occupation, the Gestapo consolidated its control over France through a centralized network directed from Paris by Helmut Knochen, who coordinated the repression operations and supervised the orders arriving from Berlin through the Sicherheitsdienst. Under his command acted Heinz Röttger, in charge of Jewish affairs, and Hans Sommer, responsible for the southern zones. From the capital, the reports sent by the regional delegations were evaluated, where local groups formed by German agents and French collaborators operated. Information was obtained through interrogations, wiretaps, and surveillance. Arrests were carried out without judicial process, and suspects were sent to camps or internment centers. The operations also included the confiscation of property, the closure of clandestine printing houses, and the surveillance of religious institutions, all under a system that acted with total autonomy from the French civil and military authorities. Control over the Jewish population was a priority. Röttger organized deportations from Drancy, Compiègne, and other detention centers. Convoys departed for Auschwitz after the preparation of lists in which both German agents and members of the French administration participated. Transportation was carried out in cattle cars, without ventilation or food. Many prisoners died before reaching their destination. The Central Office received weekly reports with the number of people sent to the east. Röttger drafted detailed communications about the system's efficiency. In 1943, raids were intensified in Paris and other cities, broadening the profile of the detainees. They were no longer limited to male adults, but also included children, the elderly, and women. The actions of the Gestapo also extended to the university world. Educational centers, cultural gatherings, and publications were monitored. Any activity considered contrary to the imposed order was sanctioned. Professors and students were arrested for expressing anti-Nazi ideas. Some universities temporarily closed after cleanup operations ordered by Berlin. Labor unions, clandestine political parties, and religious groups were also controlled. The collaboration of certain local sectors facilitated the effectiveness of these operations. Some French authorities not only cooperated, but also proposed complementary measures. The coordination between the Gestapo and the Vichy services allowed the scope of arrests to be broadened. German agents received specific training to act in occupied territory. They were instructed on the local context, customs, and infiltration methods. In several cases, they adopted false identities to approach the resistance networks. Arrests were fast and efficient, with logistical support from military units. Punishment was immediate. Many suspects were never brought to trial. They were executed after the first interrogations or sent to camps from where they did not return. The actions were documented through photographs, written reports, and recordings. Everything was archived in Berlin for the future use of the regime. In Lyon, the office headed by Klaus Barbie assumed similar tasks. It focused on dismantling evasion networks, capturing Allied emissaries, and controlling religious activities. Barbie personally directed interrogations with violent methods. Montluc prison became a torture center under his supervision. Multiple extrajudicial executions were recorded. In Marseille, Bordeaux, and Nice, these practices were replicated. Prisons were at their capacity limit. The pace of arrests was constant. Orders arrived from Paris or directly from Berlin. The exemplary effect was prioritized. Every raid had to show the power of the occupying state. In 1944, with the Allied advance, the Gestapo intensified its actions. Mass deportations, destruction of archives, and elimination of witnesses were executed. Agents received orders to leave no trace. Many transferred documents to Germany. Others were relocated to strategic positions. Nocken tried to halt the collapse by reorganizing the offices. He ordered the destruction of all compromising records. Some executions were carried out in the final weeks of occupation. In Paris, Lyon, and other key points, death sentences were issued without prior trial. The priority was to hide evidence. Several high-ranking Gestapo officials managed to escape. Others were captured after the liberation and tried by international tribunals. Collapse of hidden power, from the assassination attempt to the fall. When the assassination attempt of July 20th, 1944, which tried to eliminate Hitler, occurred, there was not only an earthquake in the Nazi top leadership, but also an abrupt turn within the security apparatus. At that moment, Canaris's Abwehr and certain implicated generals were showing increasing signs of distancing themselves from the regime's police structures. The attempt to murder the Führer was the signal that precipitated an internal struggle between army officers and Gestapo leaders. As soon as the bomb exploded, groups led by SS members were deployed in various locations to repress any movement linked to the conspiracy. While that was happening, the first interrogations were taking place in Berlin. In the offices on Wilhelmstrasse, the security service initiated arrests. Stauffenberg was shot immediately, but Ludwig Beck, Friedrich Olbricht, and others like Werner von Haaften were arrested and executed in the following days. The repressive machinery was quick to deploy its methods to extract information. One of the first to fall under the interrogations of the Gestapo was General Erwin von Witzleben. Despite his rank, he was treated with the same harshness as the other detainees. He was extensively interrogated in Prinz Albrecht Strasse. Afterward, he was transferred to prison, where he was humiliated before the trial. In the Volksgerichtshof, Freisler, who presided over the chamber, used insults and sarcasm to denigrate the accused. Most had already been sentenced before the trial. The convictions were applied swiftly, and the executions were recorded with hidden cameras. The repression was not limited to the military involved. Relatives and distant contacts of the conspirators were also arrested. The Gestapo files were filled with dossiers related to the attack. The so-called Sippenhaft was activated, a measure that allowed the arrest of relatives for familial complicity. Neither wives nor children escaped suspicion. The surveillance network even extended to the schoolmates of the implicated officers. In parallel, internal clashes began within the Nazi structures themselves. Canaris, head of the Abwehr, was closely watched since the first suspicions arose about his relationship with the resistance. His collaborator Hans Oster was also detained. Upon reviewing the Abwehr offices, Gestapo men found compromising documents that indicated the support of several intelligence members for the failed coup. That finding precipitated the dismantling of the institution. In the following months, the heads of the Gestapo and the SD took advantage of the context to eliminate internal rivals. Müller and Kaltenbrunner organized purges within the intelligence services and in various branches of the army. Many officers were transferred, demoted, or simply disappeared. The organizations that previously acted with relative autonomy were absorbed by the Reich Main Security Office. From the end of the summer of 1944, the climate within the Third Reich was one of absolute paranoia. Any sign of disloyalty, real or imagined, was recorded and persecuted. The fear of a second plot led to reinforcing wiretaps, increasing infiltrated agents, and applying systematic torture in interrogations. Prisons were filled with thousands of new names. In Berlin alone, the Gestapo rooms could not cope with processing all the detainees. In that context, Himmler's figure gained even more weight. After Canaris's fall, Himmler also absorbed counterintelligence functions. His power already extended to all branches of internal security, from the police to the concentration camps. Everything passed through his hands. Loyalty to the Reich was redefined according to the criteria of the SS. It was not enough to obey. Now, total and unwavering adherence was demanded. The courts that judged the officers of July 20 functioned as judicial pantomimes. No defenses or testimonies in favor were allowed. The sessions were brief, and the verdicts were written beforehand. Some condemned individuals were hanged with piano wire, and their deaths were secretly filmed to be shown to the regime's leaders. That brutality served as an internal warning. Even among those who had not had direct contact with the conspirators, fear arose that a phrase, a gesture, or an old relationship would be enough to be accused. The Gestapo monitored circles of friends, registered correspondence, and pressured neighbors to report any suspicious attitude. Denunciations increased exponentially in the last months of the year. As the army suffered defeats on all fronts, the Gestapo intervened more directly in political decisions. Internal security displaced military strategy. Repression became the sole axis of government. Discordant voices within the party were suppressed. Magazines were closed, meetings were prohibited, and control mechanisms were established even within the SS itself. Fear came to dominate everything. Operation Valkyrie, although unsuccessful, exposed the cracks in the Nazi apparatus. It showed that even at the highest levels there was rejection of the dictatorship. That revelation altered the structure of power. Hitler, obsessed with possible betrayals, trusted Himmler and his subordinates even more. The Gestapo became his main tool for maintaining total control. The months following the attempt were the harshest in terms of internal repression. Never before had such a wide network of surveillance and punishment been activated. The number of executions without trial multiplied. Sentences were issued in offices, not in courts. In many cases, the condemned individuals did not even know the charges against them. They were taken to prison, and days later their bodies appeared hanged or shot. The Gestapo members themselves began to operate in a logic of survival. The purges also reached regime agents who, due to jealousy or rivalries, were denounced as unreliable. A subtle competition occurred between departments. Each one sought to show more zeal than the other to avoid falling into disgrace. Meetings were filled with silences. The offices became zones of permanent tension. Some SS officials, who previously participated in external repression, were transferred to internal surveillance tasks. The enemy was no longer just communism, Judaism, or foreign resistance. Now the danger was inside. It was any official, any functionary, any subordinate with access to a file. Distrust contaminated all levels. The concentration camps began to receive not only opponents, but also party members accused of treason. The system turned against itself. Orders came directly from Berlin and were executed without discussion. No one wanted to appear as lukewarm or neutral. Everyone knew that any doubt could be interpreted as complicity. The hierarchical structure of the regime began to collapse from within. What was once a chain of command was now a network of cross-accusations. Reports multiplied without verification. Prisons were on the verge of collapse. Executions were no longer recorded. Chaos began to displace control. And in the middle of all that, the Gestapo tried to sustain a system that was collapsing under its own weight. With the defeat of the Reich, the Allies installed interrogation centers in the occupied cities. Former Gestapo members were concentrated there, trying to justify their roles in the regime. The first interviews showed that the operational network was broader than the investigators believed. By cross-referencing testimonies with internal documents, hidden structures and connections between departments that previously seemed isolated were discovered. This method changed the focus of the trials that followed. Instead of a single process, as in Nuremberg, regional hearings were organized driven by the military authorities. The British, for example, directed the proceedings in their zones. The accused were confronted with specific evidence, orders, records, and files. Many denied their involvement, but the documents pointed directly to them. The tribunals sought to verify whether the defendants knew of and participated in concrete events. The prosecution presented operational orders, arrest lists, and cases of executions without trial. Some prosecuted individuals claimed to be unaware of the crimes, but their names appeared in official memorandums. The sentences varied. Some were imprisoned, others released. In certain cases, the convicted individuals resumed positions years later. There was no common pattern, and the results generated controversy. Many former agents returned to civilian life with new identities. In West Germany, the priority was reconstruction, and investigations were not resumed for years. The Gestapo disappeared, but its methods left a trace. The last major trial took place decades later, with new evidence found in archives. That case reactivated the debate about justice and time, while the historical archive continued to grow.